Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is The Current Podcast.
We just rent a bachelor. That for us is really, really expensive. Even if we compare with Costa Rica and we live in Ireland as well, and then in Malta, the price here is really, really high.
Yes, indeed. Rent here is really, really high. And the number of people renting in Canada is now at a record level. 1/3 of Canadians rent their homes. Finding a place that's the right size, in the right area, at the right price is getting harder and harder. CBC News has a new interactive tool that shows price and availability of rentals in cities across Canada. You enter your income and your city, and it tells you the amount you should pay in rent based on a standard formula, which is 30% of your pay. Our producer, Amanda Grant, asked people in Toronto to try out the tool.
So this is the amount that it says you should be paying about in your rent. Is that close?
Even not close at all. Like, for example, we paid $1,700 just for the bachelor, and this one shows $1,250, so it's $500 less.
Yeah. So I'm paying $500 more than I should be. Obviously, like, if I lost my job right now, I would be so stressed. Like, I wouldn't be able to pay my rent. Like, I would have to, go back home, live with my parents again.
Oh, is that the amount I should be paying? When we were looking for apartments, costs were averaging around $3,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment. The number it's showing me is closer to $1,800, which is that sounds reasonable. Wow, what a reasonable idea! 30%. Yeah, that's not what we have in this city.
So you put in your income here, and it'll give you an estimate of what you could afford.
Okay.
What does it say you should be paying in rent?
$800.
And how close is that to what you're paying?
That's like less than half. That's frustrating because I feel like, wages are not covering that, and rent is just making the situation a lot worse.
How much of your income would you say goes to your rent?
40%, easy. That rent does not cover my utilities. You need to pay for heat and hydro separately. Internet is a basic human need.
Does it concern you for what it means for your long-term financial stability?
It's a Tuesday. Do you need to make me feel
I'm sorry.
so uncertain about the future? I came here for a better future for myself. Would you say this is a better future?
People in Toronto trying out this new interactive tool. You can try it out right now. It's on our website if you go to cbc.ca/thecurrent. Preet Banerjee is a personal finance commentator. Preet, good morning.
Good morning, Matt.
What does it say for people's future if they're paying such high rent?
Well, I think a lot of people are feeling pretty disenfranchised because there's a lot of people who are paying a lot more in rent than that guideline of 30% of income suggests. And it's depressing. It is partly a function of there's a lot of people who want to be homeowners, but they can't. And so they are relegated to renting. So there's a lot more people looking for the same number of rentals, and that's driving up the price. And people are feeling very disillusioned.
Can we talk about the 30% number? This is the common wisdom, that people shouldn't spend more than 30% of their gross pay on rent. Where did that number come from?
Yeah, I've been doing some digging on this number, actually, and it actually goes back to 1968 out of what was called the Fair Housing Act in the United States. And this was an act that was sponsored by, or I guess authored by, Edward Brooke and Walter Mondale. And that act made it illegal to discriminate housing qualification on the basis of race. And 1 year later, it was amended to introduce a 25% cap on income in terms of getting access to public housing. So the original intent of where this number came from was as a threshold so that the poorest of the poor who get housing through various public programs shouldn't be expected to pay more than 25% of their income, because that became a delineation of what was a cost-burdened household. And in 1981, that cap was raised to 30%. In 1981, if you remember, is when interest rates and inflation was well into the double digits. Mm-hmm. So 30% comes from a long time ago, and it was meant to address housing access for people on the lower end of the income spectrum. And so a lot of people have said that 30% number is in no way realistic of what the average household would expect, and certainly not realistic for today's day and age.
What do you think a more realistic number would be in 2024?
Right. So I can tell you what the actual number is. And if you take a look at sort of median income and average level of rent, it's around 63%. Now, that doesn't mean that
63% is what people are paying, 63% of their gross pay.
Yeah, and I think if you ask a lot of people who are living in the urban centers of Toronto, Vancouver, how much of their income is going towards housing costs, it's going to be well over 50% in many cases, especially if you are a new homeowner or you're recently, left the nest. Now, I'm not suggesting that should be the guideline, but it definitely should be somewhere between 30 and 63. So I would say, in today's day and age, if you want to have the ability to live your life as well, you want to keep it under 50%. But even that's tough.
What are the impacts on people's lives in terms of their personal finances and their financial future when they are paying 50, 60, 63% of the money they take home to keep a roof over their head?
Yeah. So from a strictly personal financial point of view, if you're putting more money towards just putting a roof over your head, it's less money on everything else, including saving for retirement, saving for the future, and also your ability to save up for a down payment to become a homeowner if that is what you want to do. Because, if you're a renter, again, so much of your income now is being put towards rent that, you go back 10 years ago and rents were a lot lower. You had the ability to save on the side, but now people don't have the ability to save at all once you factor in rent and utilities and what have you. So again, people feel really disenfranchised by sort of, the cost of rent as not to mention the cost of, being a homeowner as well.
Do you think those days are over and done with? That you could dream about owning a home and rent while you stashed a little bit of money away? Is that over and done?
Well, things move in cycles. I think this is going to be a very long cycle. It took a long time to get to this point, and barring any type of, nasty recession, which would affect people in terms of losing jobs as well. But if you were the ones who sort of made out better than everyone else during a very hard recession, maybe you would get back to that sort of state of affairs. But again, that would require something bad, some big economic shock to happen that would affect a lot of people. So I don't think that there's any short-term solution. I think that this does move in a cycle. Things will ease eventually. We're seeing steps being taken. But all the steps that are being taken, all the announcements that we hear from various levels of government, as bold as they might seem relative to announcements we've heard before, because this has been such a long problem boiling up for such a long time, it's going to take a while before we start to really see some easing.
The chief economist for Manulife, Francis Donald, said yesterday that it could take at least a decade before housing in Canada gets to affordable levels.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of Francis's, and she's very sharp. And I think that as far as forecasts go, I think that's in the realm of what I would consider a prudent forecast.
In the meantime, we've spoken to people on this program from across the country who live in tiny homes. They live on boats. They live in a converted school bus because they can't afford an apartment or a home. What do you say to people who run the math through this interactive tool and they can't find mainstream rental options that they can afford?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is where we have to think about, just how much we have to make trade-offs. And everyone has been making trade-offs already, but we have to go deeper than the world that we grew up in. And so when we have this base case of the world we grew up in where you didn't have to make such extreme trade-offs, it feels very unfair. But if we take a look at some of these trade-offs, some of these are things that we have in our control, and others I think are just completely unfair. So, for example, we're hearing more and more about people who are staying with partners they don't want to be with because financially leaving them or breaking up and having two homes to maintain just isn't going to work. And so you have people who are stuck in relationships that they don't want to be with. On the flip side, you have some people who might be looking for relationships for financial reasons, taking a bit higher of a priority than before. People are delaying having kids. We're seeing smaller weddings. People are not living the lives that they expected to live.
Preet, good to talk to you as always. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.
Preet Banerjee is a personal finance commentator. Carolyn Weitzman is a housing policy researcher and author of a forthcoming book, Home Truths, Fixing Canada's Housing Crisis. She's in our Ottawa studio. Carolyn, good morning to you.
Good morning, Matt.
Preet was talking about the personal impact of high rents. You don't need to tell people that because they're living through it right now. But when you look at the broader society and the broader economy, what does it do to those parts of our lives when people have less income to spend on things other than shelter, when all of their money or a huge part of their money is going, as we say, just to keep a roof over their head?
Yeah, it's terrifying, isn't it, Matt? Canada has one of the highest levels of personal debt in the world, and most of that is housing costs, and about 14% of Canada's GDP is held up in housing investments, and that's about double what is going on in other OECD countries, which means that there's less money not only to put into local restaurants, local entertainment, but also less money that can go into new productive technologies to help us deal with climate change and to build up a strong economy in Canada. And actually, the OECD and the World Bank and a bunch of other organizations have been raising red flags about Canada's economic performance for years now, partly on the basis of our extremely high housing costs, high rents, high home costs.
When you play around with this interactive tool, I mean, in a city like Vancouver, if you put in $75,000 for a family income, which is high to some people but might be low to others, it kind of plays it right through the middle. You're looking at spending between 50 to 75% of your income for a two-bedroom home, according to this tool. And that's in and around Vancouver. It's a bit better in Atlantic Canada and cities like Halifax and Moncton, city like Toronto, also incredibly expensive. What happens when huge parts of a city or even an entire region become unaffordable for people who aren't wealthy?
Well, we see vast numbers of people driving until they qualify. We see people putting off or not having children. And as Preet mentioned, we see people staying in violent relationships or with harassing landlords because there simply aren't any other choices. And particularly in a jurisdiction such as Ontario, where people know that there's something called vacancy decontrol, which means after you move out, a landlord can raise the rents as much as they want. People are trapped in particular homes and can't move for jobs, can't move because of violence, can't move because, for instance, they might want a smaller place because their kids have moved out. So everyone is kind of either trapped in place or desperately searching for another place. It's not a good society.
There's also this issue, and Preet mentioned people can't stash money away for later in life, for retirement. For a lot of people, home ownership is a retirement plan. If you have a generation that isn't building home equity for retirement, what are you concerned about there?
Well, there's a huge generational inequality going on right now, and really we should be thinking about, what are we doing for the next 7 generations in the future? Certainly, speaking as a boomer, I've seen we have 2 children, and they have very different choices than the choices that we faced. Quite often, young people who are buying homes, and housing is very unaffordable for the vast majority of households under 35. If they don't have the bank of mom and dad to rely on, they're in rough shape. And part of the problem is that landlords, tenants, are such second-class citizens in Canada. There are richer societies like Germany and Austria and Denmark, Switzerland, where the majority of households are renters. They have long-term leases. They are not subject to the same kind of precipitous rent rises as we've seen in many cities across Canada.
We still have a stigma around this too. There's a large portion of society that might believe if you're renting because you can't afford to own, or that you're renting because you're in the process of trying to get to that place where you can own.
That's right. And people buy because renting is such a terrible option for many of them. And then they end up with mortgages and or living very far from their work or their friends or their families. And that's not a particularly good situation as well. So you don't want people buying just because they're desperate not to be renters.
We have a lot of policies in this country aimed at making home ownership more attainable. Should we be thinking about ways to make renting more attractive and affordable?
Absolutely. The current budget promised a tenant bill of rights as part of provincial infrastructure agreements. I very much look forward to what that's going to look like yet. There's been no hint as to what that would look like. But some of the things it might look at are things like rent banks to stop growing rates of eviction, longer leases, no vacancy decontrol as there are in a number of provinces, including Ontario, and just ways to stem the tide of evictions. 1 in 16 Canadian households tenant households were evicted between 2016 and 2021. It was 1 in 10 in BC. That's just an unacceptable level of uncertainty for tenants, and the vast majority of those evictions had nothing to do with not paying the rent or being disruptive or whatever. It was rent evictions. It was landlords saying that they wanted to move into the unit, and quite often not moving into the unit. It was demolishing affordable rental buildings. So we've got a crisis on our hands, Matt.
Is it purely supply and demand?
Well, it's the right supply. So a lot of the money in the National Housing Strategy has gone to building rental units that are unaffordable to the vast majority of renters. There hasn't been enough money going into non-market housing. So co-ops, public housing, community housing, where evidence shows that rents rise much more slowly over time, and there are much, much lower rates of evictions.
Politicians seem seized with this issue, in part because people are very angry and they worry about their jobs, that if people are angry and they don't see the results, they'll vote them out of office. Do you think what we have seen in terms of the announcements in housing over the past few months will make a real dent in the rental crisis in this country?
There are very few short-term fixes. I think that some of the ideas around building on government land, well-located government land, about scaling up non-market housing are all great ideas. They're going to take 3 to 5 years to happen. I think in the short term, there have been times in Canada's history during World War II, during the 1970s, and of course most recently over COVID, where the federal government and provincial governments have stepped in with rent freezes, with eviction freezes, and I think we're at that point in the crisis where those kinds of immediate short-term fixes need to be considered.
In the meantime, you have a book coming out soon about how to fix this crisis, and we'll have you back to talk about it because I want to know the details.
Yay.
Yay, she said. But when you hear Frances Donald from Manulife say that this is going to take a decade before housing gets back in this country to affordable levels, does that seem accurate to you?
Well, I hate to end this interview on a downer note, Matt, but I think it's been 30 to 50 years that we've been pursuing the wrong housing policies. I think it's going to take a generation for us to get out of the situation we're in right now. I do think that Canada's housing crisis is fixable, but I think that it's going to take the kind of sustainable and coordinated action from all levels of government, from the private sector, from the non-market sector, to really turn things around. And I look forward to a federal government, because the buck kind of stops at the federal government, that recognizes that, and that it's not seen as a political football, but that there's a real long-term plan.
I look forward to our next conversation about the book and about the details. In the meantime, Carolyn, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.
Carolyn Weitzman is a housing policy researcher in Ottawa and author of a forthcoming book, Home Truths, Fixing Canada's Housing Crisis. If you are renting your home, if you don't mind me asking, how much of your pay goes to your rent? Are you renting by choice, How do you make ends meet if you are paying 50, 60 or more than 60% of your take-home pay to just keep a roof over your head? What is it like to rent in this country in 2024? Email us, thecurrent@cbc.ca.